Lovers of lore, thank you for joining me for the conclusion of the Brothers' War story. Now, in the previous installment, poor Lauren had just fallen into the clutches of Ashnod, and our story continues far in the future. At this point, Harbin, Urza's son, is 26 years old. He spent a dozen years as a messenger and a scout. Now, he's been craving frontline combat post-action, but his parents have stymied that. So the only action he's really got were the few times that he was spotted and chased by flying dragon engines, and he was able to lead them to clockwork avian flocks, and those flocks destroyed the engines. But other than that, he basically was involved in very boring work. Except one day on a routine mission, a storm blows him out to sea, and he's stuck in this storm for 3 days and 3 nights straight. He eventually manages to fly out of it, and he finds that there's actually an island surrounded by this giant storm, and he sees a beach. He's barely able to crash land down on it, and he passes out. When he wakes up, he sees that there is a gigantic, lush jungle beside the beach that he is on. And compared to the rest of Dominaria, it was basically a paradise, considering how destroyed everything else was. So, Harbin checks over his ornithopter. It is a new, more rugged design, which was useful for him. It's why he survived, but it didn't make it intact. There is one strut broken. So Harbin grabs out his emergency kit, gets the axe specifically, and heads off into the jungle to get the wood that he'll need to fix his ornithopter. Now, unknown to him, he's actually being watched by an elf who lives on the Isle of Argoth. Her job is to keep an eye on intruders, and if they violate any rules, for example, if they damage nature in any way, then her job is to destroy them. Now, in the meantime, word has already been sent to the one city on the island of Argoth, Citadel, to let them know that the intruder had arrived. But in the meantime, Gwenna was only supposed to watch the intruder and see what would happen. So, the intruder, Harbin, he ends up going out into the forest. Now, Gwenna was intrigued by him. He was different than the other intruders that she had seen. A lot of them, when they washed up on the beach, they were haggard, they had come from ships, but this intruder had actually flown down onto the beach, and she had never seen anything like it. So she's watching him. He finds a sapling that is suitable to replace the missing strut of the ornithopter, and he ties a strip of his shirt around it. Then he heads back to the ornithopter to grab the rope he's going to need to drag the tree back after he's cut it down. Now, Gwenna was intrigued enough that she needed to know how he was able to fly, and she knew that if she let him cut down that tree, it would cost him his life. So what she did was quickly find a similar sized sapling that had been uprooted in a storm, and she left it in the path that Harbin would take coming back to reach the tree that he had tied that cloth around. So Harbin comes back, sure enough, sees the sapling laying there. He's confused by it, but decides not to question his luck, shrugs, and drags the sapling off. It took him about 4 days to fix the ornithopter, and lucky for him, the only thing he took from the forest was water. He ended up fishing for his food, and since Titania only cares about the lands, and those are creatures of the water, he was not violating any rules. After the 4th day, he had the ornithopter completely repaired, and he flew off. Gwenna was left with an ominous feeling. She never thought he'd be able to repair his device and fly away. After Harbin returned back to Urza, there were plans laid for him to lead an expedition to the Isle of Argoth for its glorious resources. There was not just the massive jungle, but there were also mountain ranges that could be stripped for ore. Now the story turns to Mishra's camp. Now Mishra's gotten fatter. He's got bad lungs because there's this yellow smoke that hangs over Tomakul where he is staying. Now he had finally taken the ivory towers, but none of their knowledge helped him. The lands were ruined. Mishra had no interest in anything regarding magic. He believed it to be nonsense. He didn't need magic. His devices were deadly enough. His Armageddon clocks had fused giant areas of land into glass that were unusable to everyone. Unfortunately, Mishra's empire was falling apart, so he turned to the Gixian priests. They had been experimenting with augmenting flesh using metal. In fact, the head priest had metal bolted over where his eyes should be, in a grisly imitation of Phyrexians. The Gixians promised Mishra power, and Mishra agreed to hear them out. Speaking of Gixians, Gix himself learned about the Isle of Gargoth from his Gixian priests, and then he took the information, realizing that only Urza had learned about the island, and he gave that information to one of his priests that served in Mishra's court to make sure that it got passed on. At the same time, he gave one of his priests instructions to get caught by Urza as a spy for Mishra and reveal only under torture that Mishra intended to go to the Isle of Argoth and claim it personally. So Harbin's expedition party arrives at Argoth. It is a massive fleet. They're coming in by land and air. And once they disembark, they start to immediately log the forest. Gwenna the Watcher Elf is there seeing this happen, and she pulls back to form a war party. There's no need to wait to hear back from Sentinel in this situation. The story then switches over to Ashnod. Ashnod has actually learned the rudiments of genuine magic. Lauren was held captive long enough for Ashnod to gain a good deal of information, but ultimately Lauren was able to escape. Now that Ashnod had the Silex and knowledge of how to use it, she planned to rejoin Mishra and show him her power. But when she arrived at where she expected Mishra to be, she found out that he had already had ships built and he had left for Argoth. Everything ends up going according to Gix's plans, as Urza ends up getting fed the information from Gix's informant. On the Isle of Argoth, Harbin and his troops had started to build giant towers along the beach, and they were facing massive attacks by elves, tree folk, animals that were under their sway as well were joining in, so they were forced to clear more and more of the forest to stop these attacks. This resulted in huge losses for the Argivians. After months of this costly war of attrition, a letter arrived for parley, and a flight of ornithopters was led by Harbin to a special clearing that had been made. Harbin and his followers were given safe passage and led through a beautiful elven city to meet Queen Titania. Well, her avatar, ancient eyes wrapped in vines with a wooden mask. Titania spoke to Harbin through a proxy known as the Speaker. "Leave these lands or die. This is Gaia's law." Harbin attempted to enlist her aid. "We need your lumber to fight a great evil. Mishra will come and destroy this place." Titania's avatar was silent for a moment, and then she spoke. "The one you speak of is already here. He is to the west, destroying Argoth, as you are to the east right now." Harbin tried to seize on that. "Ally with us against Mishra." Titania's response was disdainful. "What of your allies, the Sardian dwarves? What happened to them when you found out they were also helping Mishra? You slew most of them and enslaved the rest. And what of Yosha? Gaia whispers to me how great swaths of land are now pure glass." Harbin yelled that what happened to Yosha was Mishra's fault, but Titania was distracted. She looked off in the distance and then let out a blood-curdling scream. At the same time, her mask shattered and leaves fell off the vines of her avatar. There was panic throughout the room, and Harbin felt very vulnerable, considering that the only thing stopping these troops from attacking him was Titania's word, and she was currently not able to do anything other than scream. It didn't take long for Titania to recover, at which point she said, "You will all leave. Go and tell the others." When Harbin and his men arrived back at the ornithopters, they found that they were surrounded by a circle of druids, and the druids started to chant. As they did so, the ornithopters started to break apart and crumble down into basic elements. It was a demonstration of nature's power, and the speaker pointed out, "We could have done that to you while you were airborne on your way here. Enjoy your walk back." Now we jump back to Ashnod, still on her quest to find Mishra and make her way back into his good graces. So she gets a boat to Argoth and ends up finding Hajar, because she knows if she just shows up directly to Mishra unannounced, it will probably not go well. So Hajar takes her to Mishra's quarters, where she sees that things have very much changed, considering that Mishra now has 2 Gixian door guards, and Hajar has to wait outside. When Ashnod actually got to see Mishra, she realized that he was much stronger and thinner looking than the last time that she had seen him. He looked at her bemused. "I thought that I banished you from my lands." And Ashnod came back, "These don't really seem to be your lands right now, but I can help with that." Mishra didn't seem super interested, but he did ask, "What are you offering?" That's when Ashnod pulled out the Silex. "I've learned of new powers." Mishra started laughing. "Magic? A charlatan with metal cookware. That's what you've become, Ashnod? I never thought I'd see the day." At that point, Mishra lifts Ashnod's banishment. "You have potential. You will come when I call you. Now go." Ashnod was not pleased by this abrupt dismissal, but there was iron in Mishra's voice, and she did not test it. Once she got back out into the hallway with Hajar, one of the Gixian priests, specifically the one with the metal plate over his eyes, stepped out and demanded that she hand over the Silex to him. At first, Ashnod wasn't willing to do so, but it became very apparent that the Gixians have a lot of sway, and that if she didn't hand it over, they were going to make life very difficult for her, and considering the fact that they had Mishra's ear, they could be her worst enemies. So Ashnod ultimately begrudgingly handed them the chest with the Silex in it. But then when she gets back to her tent, it turns out that what she handed off was a fake. She expected something like this might happen, and so she still has the original Silex. Now the two brothers' forces are consuming the Isle of Argoth from either side, just chewing it up, and Titania is getting weaker and weaker to the point where she withdraws to her private sanctuary. Through some clever maneuvering, Ashnod was able to convince the forest elves to raid Urza's forces along the shore. But even doing so, Mishra still was unwilling to elevate her position and sent her back to her tents after thanking her for her work. The elves that threw themselves against Urza's troops were obliterated. It was pitiful. They had little wooden weapons that were a joke. Their tree folk were set on fire. The only thing they could muster that was a genuine threat was a towering tree elemental with a stone sword the size of a mountain. But Urza had already brought a Colossus of Sardia over onto the island. Originally, he was using it as a lighthouse, but now it was called into battle. A massive titanic behemoth of metal and stone plates. And so the Colossus and this gigantic tree elemental go at it. The tree elemental slams its stone sword into the side of the Colossus, knocking one of its stone plates off. And the Colossus reaches over and tears off one of the tree elemental's arms. And the entire jungle screams in pain as the Colossus whips the tree elemental's arm far, far across out into the waters. Then the giant forest elemental crushed the Colossus's head, but the Colossus didn't need its head to keep going, so it rears back and slams its fist directly through the elemental's chest. And this is too much for it. It breaks apart as the jungle screams out again, and it just falls down, crushing elves and humans underfoot. But this was also too much for the Colossus, and it shudders and falls to the ground. After the battle ends, scouts report that Mishra's army has been spotted 5 days out. They will arrive on the last day of the year. And there's this amazing callback to the earliest days of the story, where Urza muses about how on the last day we're equal. I love it. The two brothers will face off on the last day of the year, which Mishra always insisted was the day that they are equal. They will meet on equal footing, having chewed up the entire island of Argoth between them. The final battle started at dawn. Dragon engines and transmogrants, Philology soldiers, war machines, and flying dragon engines were all sent forward by Mishra in a direct attack. But Urza had chosen a defensive strategy. He had his Triskelions in the center, with war engines arrayed around them. He had his clay statues, Avengers, Sentinels. He had shapeshifters made of clay. He had Tetravis, clockwork avians, and ornithopters all ready to meet Mishra's charge. And as had always been the case up until now, the forces roughly balanced each other out. Until abruptly, Out of nowhere, Tanos is almost cut down by one of his own Yoshin soldiers. As all of the constructs around him start fighting each other, Yoshin soldiers are hacking each other apart, and no matter what he does, he can't get them back under control. So he's forced to start to flee. And as he moves around, he finds that this is actually happening all over the battlefield. Constructs are going wild. He runs into Ashnod and demands, "Are you responsible for this?" She says, "It's not me." And they group up and head off together. Now they're about to get slaughtered by a dragon engine when suddenly it just stops and ignores them and leaves. And the reason for that becomes apparent when the hideous demon Gix steps out. He wants to gloat and brag about how he's brought Urza and Mishra together and how only one of the brothers will survive, and he's going to drag them back to Phyrexia and everybody else will be destroyed, including their apprentices. And Gix wishes to slay them himself. So he leaps forward, claws extended, and Ashnod, to her credit, whips her staff out and just blasts Gix full on with her nerve-frying magic. It's so powerful that it actually stops Gix from being able to move forward. While she's doing this, she reaches back, unslings her backpack, tosses it to Tanos and says, "Take this to Urza. Tell him to fill it with memories of the land. Go." Tanos wouldn't leave though. He started reaching for his weapon, and Gix, he's slowly moving forward and his talons are getting longer with a vicious grin on his face, and Ashnod, her brow is covered in sweat. And I love this last part where she says, "Go, baby duck." It's her sweet little nickname for him. I love the relationship between these two. And as she says that, she blasts even more power into the staff, and Gix is even impressed by this. He says, "You've grown in power." But unfortunately, it's not enough to stop him, and he keeps coming. Now over with Urza, he's all by himself. Everyone around has fled or is dead. Most of the small constructs have been destroyed. Gix has been incredibly effective taking them all over and causing this chaos. Now there's only bigger constructs left fighting each other, and a pall of smoke hung over the entire land. And out of that smoke came Mishra. "Hello, brother." Urza was astounded. Mishra was strong and powerful. Both brothers pulled out their power stones. Mishra fainted with his weak stone in his fist, swinging it towards his brother, but at the last moment ends up stabbing Urza instead with a bladed ankh he had hidden in his other hand, cutting deep into Urza's forehead. Urza's combined pain and rage overwhelmed him. He forced it into the Might Stone, and at the same time, he drew on some unknown internal source of power, like a gate had just opened within him, and he fed that into the Power Stone as well. And Mishra got hit by the combined power, which had converged into a massive fireball. And this fireball slams into Mishra, setting him alight. It burned off his clothes and it burned off his flesh, revealing to Urza the metallic horror underneath. Mishra's body had been replaced. He had metal plates for ribs and ropes of coiled steel for muscles. Mishra was a machine now. He wasn't the only one who had changed, though. Urza had changed. He was able to draw on that inner power, and it augmented his senses. He could feel Argoth's pain now. It was his pain. And the entire plane, he could feel its pain as well. It screamed for release. Mishra had fled once he had been set on fire, and Urza was prepared for his return when he saw a figure coming back towards him, but it turned out that it was actually Tanos staggering up, and he hands Urza the Silex and explains to him what Ashnod said. "You need to fill this with the memories of the land." But his words were actually unnecessary, because by touching the Silex with his new senses, Urza instantly understood its function. And he looked at Tanos and said, "Find refuge, the deepest cave, whatever it is, go now." And Tanos took off immediately. And good for him that he did, because it didn't take long before Mishra came back. and at this point, he had melded his form with that of one of the dragon engines. So now he's man, machine, and dragon engine all melded together, and Urza is horrified by what his brother has become. And holding the Silex, he knows what he has to do. Blood is dripping down from the cut in his forehead onto the runes of the Silex. Urza summoned memories of Argive, Corliss, and many other locations on Dominaria, all while Mishra was barreling towards him, bellowing his rage. Urza wept for his brother, his tears intermingling with his blood, and power flowed into him. The land cried for release, and Urza gave it. He forced that power into the Silex, and a massive blast of light disintegrated both brothers. Argoth burned, the trees were flattened, parts of Argoth slipped into the sea, and the Silex blast continued outwards in its wave of destruction, leveling cities. Gix teleports back to the caves of Koilos, trying to escape back to Phyrexia before the blast reaches the cave. He is there manipulating the runes, opening up the portal, but the blast is already starting to cause the cave to become unstable. So the portal is opening, but it's not going to make it all the way. So Gix dives feet first towards the portal, and at the last minute, the portal winks shut. Now Gix mostly made it through, but the portal closed in time to chop off one of his arms, which is left there in the cave. Many things were destroyed in the Silex blast, but not everything. While Mishra was completely undone, Urza was actually saved by the Power Stones. They fused into his eye sockets and became a part of him, granting him Planeswalker status, making him a being far beyond any regular mortal. Years later, after the Silex blast, Gixian priests return to the caves of Koilos. They're guided by dreams. They dig up the arm of Gix because it will point the way to Phyrexia, and they start the long journey of opening a new path to Phyrexia. And as another fun little note, after all this devastation, Urza is actually able to find Tawnos alive. He had been working on a stasis chamber as a way of holding Mishra captive once Urza had defeated him. And once Urza told him to find the safest place he could, Tawnos went and hid inside of it. It turns out that it was very solidly constructed and actually managed to survive the Silex blast. So it's a fun little note that Tawnos survives. And he notices that now Urza has the gemstone eyes, and instead of glowing red and green, there is actually a filter of 5 different colors as it moves through green, white, red, black, and blue. And thus ends the story of the Brothers' War, with Urza fully ascended to Planeswalker status, leaving to explore other worlds, charging Tawnos with gathering information and trying to salvage what he can of the world. This is my absolute favorite story in the entirety of Magic's history. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you like what we're doing here, you can support us by joining the channel membership or the Patreon. And we will be back with some new versions of the Brothers' War Retold story in a couple of weeks, because that's when it's going to be released. So make sure you come back to check that out. And in the meantime, go enjoy some other lore. Remember, my friends, lore is life.